Today, myself and Deborah will jointly present some of our findings to you. The material that Deborah and I have been examining for our research is a collection of Irish medical recipes written around the turn of the 16th century. The manuscript we're working on is held in the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin with the very name manuscript 24B3. This manuscript has 114 pages, and our recipe collection begins on page 33 and it ends on page 93. So it takes up more than half of the manuscript. This is a substantial and important collection of about 920 recipes. The slide, which you should be able to see now, shows the beginning of these recipes. You can see the beautifully illuminated first word, is. See the capital letter I running down the side of the page and with the smaller s attached to it. Ink on this page is quite faded, as if the front page was handled quite a lot, meaning that the text is unfortunately almost illegible in places on this. The high resolution image that you see here comes from the Irish Script on Screen website. The manuscript in itself is in reality much smaller than I had imagined it to be. Often when you're looking at these large images on screen, it gives a false impression of their size. This manuscript is very portable and would have been possible to carry it from place to place in a small bag by its owner. So we know that the compiler of this collection is called Connla Mac Leagha because his name appears in several little notes. They're also called scribal colophons that are written in the margins of some of the pages. In one note, he tells us that I am Connla Mac Leagha, who has written this very much distracted in his own house on Good Friday. He includes the address, Carrageen na Sair, in Gran Shuck na Cairach. In another note, he writes the year is 1496. Elsewhere, he mentions that he is treating a man called Tumultuck O'Gara for a wounded foot and gives his location as Killaragate. These notes are very useful for the information that can be gleaned from them regarding the date, authorship, and location. Connla, who wrote this manuscript, was a practicing physician under the patronage of the Macdermot Lords in the medieval kingdom of Moylurg in County Roscommon, that's in the west of Ireland. He was a member of an Irish medical family. We know this because the surname Mac Leagha crops up in several manuscripts in the second half of the 15th century and also in the early 16th century. The other men are believed to be his father, Ilan, and his brothers, Meleclan and Owen. We can tell that this collection of recipes was intended to be used as a practical reference book because of the way in which the material is arranged. The recipes Connla Mac Leagha has included in his collection are arranged in a head-to-toe order, which is in keeping with the tradition that comes from the classical medical texts. So he begins with a chapter on the hair and continues down the body to the feet. Within these chapters, the recipes are presented in different formats: short prose recipes of a line or two, and longer, more complex recipes with up to 30 ingredients. We also have poems and charms. So the vast majority of recipes are presented in a short format, like the one on this slide. You can see in the top part of the slide, I've just a screenshot of the recipe from the manuscript. And these short recipes are organized in a standard way, beginning with the name of the disorder for which the recipe is recommended, which is also called sometimes the rubric or an indication. And then it's followed by the list of the ingredients required, a brief description of the method of preparation and application, and then ending with a statement of efficacy. This format is found in all the other European vernaculars. And it is also interesting to see how the format of recipes has changed so little since then. When we are using a recipe for food now, it still follows the same format. Here we see a cure for deafness. So this cure calls for a strawberry and stem of cowslip to be squeezed through a linen cloth into the nose, and it heals. It's interesting that this cure for deafness calls for squeezing liquid into the nostrils. It is suggestive perhaps of a temporary loss or reduction in hearing caused by congestion rather than a cure for profound deafness, but it is impossible to ascertain that from the context. The general practice is to give very little information about measurements, and there are usually only very basic instructions as to preparation and application. But it must be remembered that these were not books for use by the general public. These books would only be used by experienced medics. They would have had the training to instinctively understand, or at least we would hope so, how much of each ingredient would be needed. Of course, if we consider the ingredients called for in this recipe, the quantities would of necessity be very small, since you are squeezing the juice of plants through a linen cloth. The frequency of application would perhaps have been a useful guide though. And perhaps it was just a single dose treatment. So most of the ingredients in the herbal remedies are native Irish plants. There are a few exotic ingredients, but these are the exception. The most common ingredients that occur in our collections are substances like honey, wine, and butter, which act as carriers for the medicinal herbs. The herbs then are added to wine to make, for example, a medicinal drink, or butter to make an ointment. As I mentioned earlier, the recipes come in different formats, and I have counted 43 remedies in verse alongside the prose remedies. These poems range in length from as small as one verse of 4 lines to 23 verses. The example you can see here on the screen is a poem about eye ailments, and it takes up about 2/3 of the page. As you can see, the ink on this page is much clearer than the one on the first slide that I showed you. The 19 illuminated capitals down along the side of the page, these are the green and red capital letters, they mark the beginning of each stanza. These poems are notoriously difficult to read and translate. So the subject matter covered in the pages of this collection is wide-ranging, but it is obvious that the medieval doctor and his patient worried about the same issues that still concern us today. Although concerns about beauty, grooming, and aging seem to be a modern obsession, it is clear from the medieval literature and medical texts that personal appearance preoccupied our ancestors just as much as they preoccupy us today. Conditions like premature graying of hair and balding were considered to be a symptom of an imbalance of the humors, so remedies to combat this problem were also included. Connla's collection provides evidence of his classical medical knowledge in his reference to Galen, a 2nd century Roman physician, in the chapter on hair, which begins with a description about how hair is formed from vapors which accumulate and rise through the body, finally emerging through the scalp, forming hair. The head was seen as a chimney for the whole body through which vapors were expelled. So we're told that premature graying is as a result of corrupt humors that rise from the stomach or sometimes from the head itself. And the physician advises purging of these humors by administering an emetic to induce vomiting. Many of the ingredients listed in these emetic potions are extremely toxic, and these include plants like foxglove, black and white hellebore, and wormwood. And it would be preferred that this concoction would indeed be ejected from the body immediately. However, if the patient was not poisoned, and if the hair had not been shocked into behaving itself and returning to its preferred color, there are some alternative and possibly less dangerous treatments that can be tried. So I'm just going to share one recipe with you now. So if you wanted to dye your hair black, you're told to mix powdered oak galls. Oak gall is used to make the ink, and with the juice of white cabbage, and apply to the hair. So while you're waiting for the dye to work, the head is covered with a cabbage leaf. I am reminded of the plastic caps that are now placed on a head while modern dye is working its magic. And perhaps cabbage leaves could be recommended for use as a biodegradable substitute in hair salons instead of the single-use plastic covers we use every day. I'm going to leave you now with that mental image of clients sitting in hair salons with cabbage leaves on their heads and hand you over to Deborah, who will continue to discuss this subject matter.
Good evening, everyone. For my part of the presentation over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk very briefly about a couple more remedies from, as Siobhán said, the same Irish collection that she's just been discussing. So for the moment, we're staying, as it were, in County Roscommon with our medical scribe, Connla Mac, who's, as we've seen, was a practicing doctor in that area, and thus one who probably compiled his collection of medical remedies for fairly practical purposes, while drawing on quite a variety of different sources, some of them probably quite a lot older than the late 15th, early 16th century period in which he was working. So the particular remedies I'm going to focus on all contain features that might be described as somewhat magical or kind of ritualistic in one way or another. And there's sometimes been a tendency to dismiss these sorts of cures as some kind of weird, inexplicable folk medicine, or as examples of sort of bizarre local traditions and so on. What I hope to show you is how some of them actually give us quite interesting insight into the very multilingual and outward-looking scholarly background of the medieval Irish scribes who recorded them, who were very well versed in the broader intellectual currents that characterized medieval Europe more widely in the pre-modern period. And one of the key refrains that we see running through these examples, moreover, is the very complex relationship that existed in medieval Irish textual culture generally between contemporary Christian religious practices and ideas on the one hand, and inheritances from the very rich learned tradition of the classical and late antique periods on the other. And one basic principle of medical remedies from many different medieval traditions is, of course, what's often referred to as the Doctrine of Signatures, or sometimes simply as sympathetic magic, part of which is the idea that sort of like is cured by like. So in other words, the perceived likenesses or sympathies between the qualities or visible properties of a given natural substance, it could be a plant, an animal part, or a mineral, and a symptom or abnormal condition of the human body, meant that the substance in question might be employed to effect magical therapy on that part of the body. Now, this principle can sometimes provide the rationale for the use of medicinal ingredients that we might now consider to be kind of bizarre or unpalatable. And I've given you a couple of fairly straightforward examples of this on my first PowerPoint slide. These are all described very simply as being remedies for impotence. They're found in a chapter of Connla's text on ailments of the male reproductive organs. And in all three cures, the patient is advised to mix some kind of substance with wine and drink it. And needless to say, the wine is probably usually the nicest part of some of these remedies. So the one on the left calls simply for the fennel plant, and I'll come back to the significance of this example in a moment. But the two on the right suggest something a little more unappetizing, namely the testicles of either a rooster or a stag. And similarly, other remedies in Connla's collection suggest mixing the burnt testicles of a male badger or a boar with your wine. So presumably the idea here is that if one consumes the testicles of some particularly fertile animal, one might be able to heal the corresponding part of the human body that's causing problems with fertility. Now, several of these impotence remedies very closely resemble cures transmitted in a Latin text of the late antique period by the 4th century author Sextus Placitus, who wrote about the medicinal uses of various animal parts. In the early medieval period, his work was translated into Old English, and it's possible that the English version of his text, or perhaps similar material translated into another vernacular, might have been the intermediary via which his remedies made their way into Irish tradition. However, other magical remedies in our Irish text can ultimately be traced to an even earlier Latin work, namely the natural history of the Roman author Pliny, who lived in the 1st century. And the natural history is a massive encyclopedic work in 37 volumes that includes lengthy sections on medicinal remedies derived from plants, animals, and minerals. And quite frequently, Pliny's medical advice is echoed in the remedies from our Irish text, either directly or indirectly. So, for example, I mentioned earlier that one remedy to cure impotence recommends the use of the fennel plant, and this may well ultimately derive from Pliny's statement that fennel creates an abundance of seed and can be boiled down with wine and medicinal preparations. But of course, by the time this doctrine makes its way into our Irish text, it's assumed the very terse, kind of concise form typical of medieval medical remedies across many different languages, as described a little earlier by Siobhán. However, other remedies in our Irish collection that clearly derive from Pliny seem to reflect a somewhat more direct translation of his text. As an example of this, we might consider this remedy on here in the PowerPoint slide for an ailment described as cothoch. Now, modern dictionaries of the Gaelic languages typically render this term as something like rage, fury, insanity, or madness. But the context for this cure in Connla's collection indicates that he probably understood it to be a cure for a condition like epilepsy. Now, epilepsy was obviously a difficult condition to treat and wasn't necessarily well understood in the medieval period. Indeed, it was often associated with lunacy. And probably as a consequence of this, one tends to find more charms and kind of magical remedies associated with it. But here, in any case, we find the advice that for cothoch, one should put the brain of a she-goat through a gold ring and give it to an infant after birth before it tastes food, and frenzy will not seize it. Now, although the source for this remedy isn't acknowledged in Connla's text, this Irish passage is actually a pretty close translation of a remedy Pliny claims to have gotten secondhand from the Magi, or the magicians, which he says was intended to guard babies from epilepsy and other diseases of babies. Another important aspect of magical healing that's quite prominent in many medieval medical texts is the use of powerful words or language to effect a given cure. And such remedies are often referred to as charms or textual amulets, and are frequently included in medieval remedy books alongside other types of ordinary herbal prescriptions. Although, as we've seen, many of those so-called ordinary prescriptions contain examples of sympathetic magic as well. Now, Connla's text contains well over 24 cures that feature verbal incantations of some kind, and many more that involve inscribing powerful letters or words onto an object. And we tend to find more remedies of this sort for ailments that were probably thought to be somewhat intractable in nature, or perhaps more likely to pass or improve on their own relatively quickly, such as nosebleeds, insomnia, cuts, impotence, or epileptic fits. And sometimes these charms can provide interesting insight into cross-cultural and cross-linguistic borrowing. For example, Connla's chapter on ailments of the nose contains 4 incantations for staunching blood, one of which appears in garbled form in an Old English remedy collection compiled in the 9th century, while another actually itself contains 3 Old English words. The remedy from Connla's text on the next slide likewise illustrates the kind of healing power that could be associated with spoken and written language. And here it's suggested that if one wishes to cure the ailment cothoch, probably epilepsy, which as we've seen already, they should inscribe a sequence of letters, as well as the patient's name, onto a cup, and then drink a herbal concoction from that cup repeatedly for a period of 9 days. Presumably, of course, the idea here is that the liquid drunk from the cup would have in some way absorbed the magical power of the inscribed symbols. There are several comparable examples of this sort of remedy in medieval medical manuscripts from both Ireland and elsewhere. And oftentimes the sequence of letters to be written down seems quite random. It's difficult to figure out exactly what their perceived significance was. In this particular case, however, the author of the remedy has revealed kind of a glimpse of his own learned background as a literate scribe, since he doesn't refer to the letter sequence using the general Irish term literacha, or letters, a borrowing from Latin littera, but rather specifically as muti or mutes, another Latin borrowing. The term mutes was commonly used in Latin grammatical tradition to refer to a specific linguistic category of letters, mainly comprising what we'd now understand to be consonantal stops, so letters like B, P, C, and so on. And indeed, the letters listed in Connla's cure for epilepsy correspond exactly to those described as mutes by the 6th century grammarian Priscian, whose Latin grammar was hugely influential on the work of medieval Irish scribes and on the development of Irish vernacular literacy from the early medieval period. Of course, we're talking about fairly elementary grammatical knowledge here. There would be nothing particularly obscure about the concept of mute letters to any medieval Irish scholar who'd received even a very basic level of training in literacy, which would presuppose some knowledge of Latin texts. But of course, it's important to bear in mind that literacy in general is something accessible only to a relatively small portion of the population, particularly in the early medieval period. And consequently, the author of our cure for epilepsy might well have thought that even something as straightforward as this concept of mute letters might have had a certain air of mysteriousness and therefore power to it in the eyes of the uninitiated. And indeed, this kind of broader concept of literacy as a sort of select skill is something that we see articulated much more explicitly in a number of other medieval Irish texts, and is very much connected to the idea that knowledge of the written word could grant one exclusive access to the world of Christian scripture and therefore divine knowledge. Sacred written texts, like the Gospels, provided a means of connecting with a divine power that could in turn be called upon to effect healing of both a physical and a spiritual nature. As a consequence, the manuscripts in which such sacred texts were transmitted sometimes themselves came to be seen as having healing powers. They were in effect a kind of corporeal embodiment of the divine word. We see a hint of this idea in a passage from one of the most well-known historical works by a medieval English author, namely the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, written by the monk Bede in the early 8th century. And Bede recounts a cure for snake bite that was a little bit reminiscent of our Irish scribes' advice to cure epilepsy by consuming a drink that has absorbed the power of written letters. Thus, Bede claims, as you can see on the slide here, that in the case of people suffering from snake bite, the leaves of manuscripts brought from Ireland were scraped, and the scrapings put in water and given to the sufferer to drink. The scrapings at once absorbed the whole violence of the spreading poison and assuaged the swelling. Now here, Bede may have been making a kind of allegorical allusion to the power of the word of God to combat the evil of Satan, the serpent. So we needn't necessarily take his medical advice too literally. But a specification that one should use manuscripts brought from Ireland for this purpose occurs in the context of other comments about the general healthfulness of that location, and may well also allude to the reputation of Irish scholars as a source of many sacred texts that could be used as agents of spiritual healing. At the same time, however, it's clear that the line between spiritual and physical healing and the role of sacred manuscripts in that process was often somewhat ill-defined. And here we might think, for example, and I'll finish with this slide, the later fate of the Book of Durrow, which is an illuminated Irish gospel book written around the second half of the 7th century, and named after the monastery of Durrow, County Offaly, with which it is associated. The manuscript was considered a relic of St. Columba, the founder of the Durrow Monastery, and it was claimed that in the 17th century, a local farmer actually submerged it in a cattle trough and then brought his sick cows there to drink the water that had absorbed the healing power of the book. So with this, I come to the end of my allotted time, and though I've only been able to kind of discuss a few examples of medieval Irish medical remedies, I hope to have given you some sense of the richness of the Irish medical manuscripts as a testament to medieval Irish intellectual culture in a broader European and indeed historical context.